Oh, there we go. Can you hear me and see my screen? Thumbs up. Okay, cool. Thank you. All right, my name is Brendan. I'm the Partnership Outreach Coordinator in the Agricultural Education Academic Department at the University of Minnesota and help create access for underrepresented students in our academic department and the larger college as well. I also use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm excited to share a little bit about the challenging classism topic for today. And just for all of you who are on the webinar, know that this is a recorded session so that we can use this for later purposes of education and development too. So with that being said, we have kind of a tentative agenda of how we go through the webinars. This is our final one. So a few reflective questions, some expectations that we go through, and really we just highlight a few of those. Then some language, and then really most of it is kind of a panel of question and answer time with a bunch of people who are in close proximity to the topic, who may not be experts, but have a good context and lens into which they view this topic. And then we have resources at the end. So here's our reflective questions that we offer. You're welcome to read through those, but for the sake of visual and audible access, how has class shaped your life? What were the first ideas you learned about class? How did you learn them? How are those messages incomplete based on what you know now? And how does this apply to those that you work with? So here are some of the different community norms that we have been using as our framework. And really, I'm just going to highlight a few of them, the ones with the asterisks. And we haven't really had to enforce these very much, but it's always helpful to have these as a proactive measure, just in case that there is some tension in the conversation. So first, one that I'd like to highlight is use first draft language when you're first forming a thought. So you have permission to not have all of the right words, but please do share the things that you're experiencing and thinking. Assume positive intentions, but own negative impact. So I think we can all understand that 99.9% of people probably have pretty good intentions when they're having a conversation. But sometimes the reality is that those positive intentions come across harmful. And so we also do need to own that when that's the scenario. And then practice mindfulness of both your body and mind. So understanding when you might feel tense and feeling that in your body and understanding why you're feeling open or closed to a certain idea, and just exploring that a little bit more. And then lastly, this is an invitation and not an expectation of participation. So you can listen to the fullest extent that you feel the need to do so and participate in that way as well. So with that being said, we'll go through a couple of definitions and then go through our panel. So as mentioned, this webinar is challenging classism. And so there's 3 different terms that are pretty essential to understanding the topic in general. And I would say that that's classism for one, and then also class and capitalism. So those are kind of the 3 exploration of words that we'll go through. So first of all, you can see a definition of class on your screen. I would think of it both as at an individual and a collective level. And as an individual, I think of it as a collection of your economic, your social, and your cultural capital, and then how that relates in terms to others. And at a collective level, it describes typically a group of people who are experiencing the same thing that you are. So they're in a similar economic condition, a similar cultural condition, similar social condition, and how those all intersect together. So in terms of agriculture and thinking about class, one thing that we often think about in working class is farmers, as an example of maybe what working class might be. In some cases, this might be true, but holistically, not necessarily a true example all of the time. A more accurate, holistic example related to agriculture would actually be farm workers as opposed to farmers. And because at the root of the working class is the idea of people who are expending physical and mental labor to produce economic value for whoever has the ownership over the means of production. So sometimes farmers have farm workers and therefore are not necessarily working class. The second definition that I would go through is classism. So this is kind of the dominant, I think of this in terms of a dominant narrative that assumes that middle class is the norm. Just like when we think about racism, we assume that white is the norm. When we think about sexism, we assume that male is the norm. And classism is assuming maybe not necessarily just middle class, but middle class and higher is the norm. So it's kind of erasing the existence of working class, lower middle class, poor class people that are also in the world. And classism occurs in the ways that our systems and institutions are especially not built to be made accessible for those individuals that are not a part of the dominant narrative. So classism really serves to maintain class. And one thing that I really think of right away and would be remiss not to mention in terms of classism, excuse me, is not acknowledging how race plays into that. And if we think of class in terms to its intrinsic link to racism, and specifically thinking about the enslavement and exploitation of Black and brown people over the course of history, or specifically building the agricultural system of our food production that we have. And a lot of times we think that that has evolved in terms of progress, and we think of going from enslavement to servanthood, indentured servanthood, excuse me, to sharecropping, to Jim Crow, but in still ways that's still evolving in terms of class too, into like the prison industrial system and how convict labor is used in agriculture, and just new Jim Crow laws in general that are still exploiting those Black and brown bodies for a sort of gain in class for certain groups of people at the expense of other groups of people. All right. And then the last definition is capitalism that I would share. And I'm gonna also name, before even just sharing anything about this, that this conversation has a lot of nuance, and obviously there are different perspectives into it. And so what I'm sharing is kind of what I've learned, researched, and the resources that I've put together. But obviously there is definitely nuance to this conversation, and my lens is one lens and doesn't speak to the entirety of existence of viewing the framework of classism. So capitalism, when I think of capitalism, I tend to think of production, profit, property, or excuse me, productivity, profit, and property. And especially at the expense of somebody else's labor and oftentimes their humanity. So going back to that idea of, again, of like class being intrinsically linked with race, thinking about how we specifically use the productivities of certain bodies to gain profit in the long run. So a lot of times in capitalism, what people produce or the kind of work that they do is considered a large part of how they're a contributing member of to society. And this is actually a good example of the immigration debate that we see in agriculture. A lot of times I think that agriculture is kind of known as being a little bit more progressive, quote unquote, in the immigration debate in agriculture. And we may be progressive to employ immigrants on farms, but more of the reality of that progression is the reality that we continue to exploit Black and brown people, specifically Black and brown immigrants on farms, to put in certain labor so that it's at the benefit of the farm owner, rather than thinking about what is the value of their humanity instead. So there's essentially three things that kind of determine class that Teaching Tolerance specifically has as a resource. So thinking about economic capital, social capital, and cultural capital, which I mentioned earlier. Economic capital is essentially the ownership of property. It's your wealth that you have, the sort of value that's really can be monetized. So ownership of property is obviously an example of that. You can also think about investment in stocks and retirement, generational inheritance that you might gain from parents or caring adults in your life, owning a business or large assets that you might have. That's all examples of economic capital. And then there's social capital. So who you know and who knows you. So that might be like if you're looking for a job and you know somebody who works at a construction company, and then they can set you up with a job at the construction company. That's kind of an example of social capital. And then there's also cultural capital, which I like to think about at both the individual and a more generational and collective level, both ways. So at an individual level, for cultural capital, you might think of a student who attends a university that their parents graduated from, and so they're able to have some sort of familiarity with the campus, how it works in the admission cycle to get into it, and they just have some sort of knowledge of a certain situation based on other people that are kind of in their life. And then I think about it also in terms of a more collective generational level, and specifically referring to kind of entire demographics. Like white people have historically had a lot more cultural capital in terms of achieving higher education. For people of color, the system can be a little bit more difficult to navigate because there's a lack of cultural capital that has been passed down from generation to generation. So if my parents went to college, it's more than likely that I also will go to college too. Whereas if you're thinking about enslavement of people over 400 years, or even beyond enslavement of people, just the exploitation of people and their bodies over that long period of time, they haven't necessarily had that opportunity, so they're not able to pass down that cultural capital in the same way. And then also a lot of these different kinds of capital can intersect. Thinking about like financial literacy could be an example of cultural capital. Like how do you know what stocks to invest in? What's the best type of insurance? And that then can intersect with economic capital and thinking about what kind of value is placed on your life. Ooh, I'm seeing, I think, getting a lot of distracting background noise, so I'll try and not make any more noise. I'm not really sure what I'm doing, but let me know if that's still the case. This is the last slide, or actually just kidding, there's 3 more slides, but the last 2 are quick. So classism in United States history, basically class actually predates slavery. So white and black labor classes have always existed together, but the way that slavery and racism and race as a construct really came about was in a way that kept the white and black labor classes from uniting with each other, and so then therefore continued to lead to the exploitation of black bodies, and then in the future brown bodies as well. And because of this has created really a very binary approach to understanding class and race, and we don't always understand this intrinsic link to each other. And then I guess the 2 final bullets that I would highlight in the United States history is that it's very rooted in Western individualism versus a more collective understanding of how we achieve production in the United States or in the world in general. And then there's also the false myth of meritocracy. So meritocracy meaning kind of that quote that you've probably heard, that you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. The idea that if people just worked hard enough, they would be able to pull themselves into this upward social mobility, and that hard work and perseverance naturally lead to more success in life. The reality is that individual merit is not always rewarded, and for people advantaged by the system, believing the system is fair doesn't create any conflict for you, and you can feel good about how you made it. But when the system, for people marginalized by the system, believing the system is fair also puts them in conflict with themselves and can have negative consequences as a result. And so this slide kind of just shows how we can internalize capitalism, and this is really focused much more monetarily. So you might determine your worth based on how much wealth you have. You're just concerned about money. And this is kind of the primary way in which we think about, I think, capitalism and wealth and productivity. But then there's also another part to it, which is that productivity piece that I mentioned, and thinking about, I determine my worth based on how much I work. So I'm going to answer my emails at 9 p.m. and that's going to determine my worth in society. And you feel guilty when you're not consistently achieving that means of ends for production. And so both of those ways, both the part one of internalizing capitalism and part two, are essentially the same thing, just manifesting themselves in different ways. So I know that was a lot of information, but that's all I have for now. And so we'll actually get into a question and answer panel with several different people that we have on here. So we have Tiffany, who's a teacher in Philadelphia. We have Dane, who's in California. Zane Sheehan, who's at Texas A&M. Lavin with Minnesota FFA. Erica Tiemann, who is with Illinois State Board of Education. Zane Christensen with Utah as a Utah Ag teacher, and Hannah Ledger, who's a teacher in St. Paul, Minnesota. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves, and then you can share your name, where you teach, or how you're involved with agricultural education, your connection to it, and then also how has class shaped your life or your experience in agricultural education. And I'm going to start with Lavin Rada to share, because I know that she has to get off after a little bit. So Lavin, if you'd like to go. And maybe she's not there for a second, so we could actually have somebody else go too.
Sorry, it wouldn't let me unmute. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Sorry, now I'm all flustered. What was the question?
So share your name, how you're involved in agricultural education, and how class has either shaped your life or your experiences within agricultural education.
Okay, thank you. As Brandon shared, I am Lavin Rada. I've worn a variety of hats and currently serve as the Leadership Development Coordinator for Minnesota FFA. So I do all of the programming for state and region officer training, curriculum development for our leadership conferences, that kind of work. I also work with our new teachers and coordinating our induction program. And I also taught in a classroom for 8 years in South Dakota and Minnesota. So I've seen it from a variety of perspectives. Going back a little bit personally, I grew up on a dairy farm in South Dakota, in, I would say, not poverty, but pretty darn close to it. I grew up on food stamps. I had state health care. I didn't go to a dentist until I was like 25 and married. So definitely a part of my growing up. I remember seeing tags on the angel tree at church for Christmas presents for me and my siblings. So very, and I didn't quite understand what that all meant growing up. I was lucky. I got into a four-year college at South Dakota State University. Figured out the system. I was a first-generation college student, but had a good support system through some government programs that were at my college. TRIO Student Support Services helped me a lot manage that system. But then when I got into my second teaching job is when I really started to see some of the effects of class, I would say. I am a full believer in the 3-circle model of ag education. I grew up in a chapter that did not have dues and didn't even know that was a thing until probably my last year of college. So when I taught for a year in South Dakota, I taught, the previous teacher was still there, just in a different role. So a lot of things just stayed the same. But when I went to my first program by myself, I really started to evaluate things. I saw probably about 200 students in a year. We were on a trimester system, so 12 classes a year. And our FFA program grew, but it wasn't benefiting the students that I knew really needed it. So I think it was my 3rd year in Hutchinson. We had some land that the school owned that was given to us as a crop plot. And we had to decide what we were going to do with that money. And so we decided to go to be an affiliate program. And that is when my eyes were like blasted wide open, because students who had told me for 4 years that they were not interested in FFA, they didn't want anything to do with it, all of a sudden didn't have to pay a fee, and became some of our most active members. And that's when I realized, like, our Department of Ed person always says like 40% of our students in ag ed are free and reduced lunch. But I didn't really know what that meant until that point. When students who, everyone had heard the same spiel, like, if you can't afford your dues, let me know, we'll figure it out. They don't ask. They just say, no, I'm not interested. But then once that wasn't a barrier anymore, students really opened up to it, and it just kind of shifted a lot of things in the program and really opened my eyes to the fact that students aren't going to ask for help. They're just going to say they're not interested. And so I guess that's kind of the background of my story.
Awesome. Tiffany, are you there? Would you want to share next?
Yes, I'm here.
Awesome.
Hello, everyone. So I'm Tiffany Turrentine. I am an agriculture teacher at WB Saul High School in Philadelphia. I've been teaching for about 12 years now. I came through an untraditional ag teaching route. So I started off as a researcher at the University of Pennsylvania in the medical school, and then decided to go back to school for teaching and for ag ed degree. So I've been at Saul High School since I finished my master program at Virginia Tech. As far as my background, I am from Philadelphia. I grew up in Philly, the rough streets of North Philly. So kind of don't sound like it from what the kids say, but I was also a Saul graduate. So when I heard about Saul High School, I didn't really know too much about it when I was looking at different schools, but I just knew there was more of a hands-on component in science, and there weren't too many science programs in the city. And when the time that I was in middle school, because most kids went to the neighborhood high school, and for me, my neighborhood high school was not the best or the safest high school. So typically, my parents selected Saul because of not only the commute, but it's also in a good neighborhood. Went through the whole program, wasn't really interested in agriculture until I spent the summer knowing what a cow looks like, how to handle a cow, and so forth. But at the same time, it was more of the hands-on science component that I was able to apply. And that's what intrigued me. And thinking about different careers in the sciences, I didn't want to become the traditional veterinarian, but wanted to go into like biological sciences or genetic engineering. So ag ed kind of helped with that. So that's when I went into Penn State for animal science. But my first introduction to classism, I really didn't get it at Saul because we were all the same as where we come from in different neighborhoods in the city. And back then, we didn't know what percentage of the free or reduced lunch was. So it was very high at the time, but right now we're close to 70% free or reduced lunch with our students. So when we look at classism, most of the students in the school were pretty much the same. But when we go outside of the classroom or outside of Philadelphia, that's when we see the difference in what classism is, as far as the number of students that have certain equipment, to how they're transporting back and forth to certain events, FFA events, and being able to participate in other careers. So other CDE events. So a lot of our kids now, we do give some experiences and exposures to our students, but growing up, from my perspective, it was tough because we didn't have all that, and so with our kids too. So we try to expose them to what we can. I am a first generation college grad student, so in my family, education was key. But even then, with classism, it was kind of everybody in the neighborhood was in the same position. So going to college was a big deal for everybody in the neighborhood, but it wasn't a matter of finishing. So even finishing was a huge component to my family as well as my neighborhood. And now me coming back to Saul, adding that component, the students now get to see, like, yes, I can also go in the same footsteps as my teacher because she came through the same program as I did. But that wasn't the main reason why I chose teaching, though. But one of the things that we get out with our students as far as understanding what agriculture is and how to be a part of it is we call it everyone needs to eat model. So how our students understand agriculture may be quite different than a student in Center County, Pennsylvania, but everybody still need to eat. So how do we enforce that or encompass that to the whole group? And we try to look at many diverse areas and how to bring people in, but we do have some challenges when our kids go out to different chapters or go to chapter events to explain to them how they do agriculture. They're a little timid about it. So I try to encourage the kids and say, hey, agriculture is the same. We still got to eat. How do you bring them to the table, just like a dinner table? So we are doing different programs here at Saw High School where we've had leadership conferences where we invite chapters from different schools in the state to talk about the diversity of agriculture. Like, we still got to eat at the same table, but how do you bring that food to the table? We had a successful program recently, and we did in previous years, where we actually had the kids stay overnight. And we invited many schools over. So it kind of opened up for our students, but also opened up for other students from different chapters to kind of get used to each other, but also see that everybody's here for the same reason. They got to eat. So again, I can go on and on, but as far as the topics and what we try to do and incorporate with kids, this is a pretty good issue, but we try to make it so that it's unified for everyone.
Thank you. Would you like to share next? Yeah, you. yeah. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah. Okay, there we go. Sorry. My name is Dane White. I am a 12-year ag teacher at Galt High School in Central California. To be quite honest, this topic's really, I think, interesting because my past and my future is a little bit of a dichotomy in terms of classism. I think probably ultimately I'm like the beneficiary of traditional classist thinking in education, like middle class, Caucasian male. Certainly grew up with the narrative at home that I would go to college. It just was kind of more of a question of where and for what. So I think, like, my background, ag ed was a really easy fit for me. I mean, I grew up in town and my parents don't farm, but, you know, academically equipped, relatively moderately intelligent, but, you know, like, had some sort of means at home to, like, do things. So, you know, the structure and systems of ag ed were never terribly challenging for me, simply because my parents could write the check. I mean, we weren't like wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, but my parents had the means to allow us to do all the things that come sort of with this ag education world. And then, you know, was pretty engaged in FFA, and then turned around later and decided to teach. and I am at my first teaching job. I've been here since I graduated, and it's been very interesting because our community, it's far from where I'm from originally. Demographically, this town had one high school originally, and the ag program when I started here served a very classic ag education model of student. Kids who looked and came from backgrounds not dissimilar to my own. And so it was a very high achieving program, lots of notoriety for, this record of accomplishments. And yet really, when you kind of dove into it, only served kind of a traditional band of students who had the means to do things. And so there was a real shallowness to what was happening here. And then in my fourth year here, our district had grown enough that they built a new high school. And the population of students that were really being served by this ag program all ended up at the new school across town. And so the population that showed up here after the split was not being well served by this program. And that was a function of systems that didn't correlate to some of the classist challenges that population was serving. So we went from, 30 to 40% free and reduced lunch to now about 76% free and reduced lunch. And as was stated, there's a very strong correlation in the Central Valley of California between lower middle class, those who struggle a little bit with, almost entirely Hispanic population. And it's really interesting. I like my job more than I liked it my first few years, simply because I think we've adapted systems to serve those students well. But it wasn't necessarily very easy. Our program went from 500 students to 180 students, and I was split between both high schools. I was teaching regular science and ag. And then we found ways to adapt to serve kids who are here. And we now have about a little over 600 kids in a high school of 900, and predominantly Hispanic population in our program who are leading. We have about 115 kids in ag leadership here. And it's, again, classism isn't really necessarily something that our students deal with internally. As Tiffany mentioned, it's something that greets us when we experience things outside of Galt. And I think we have a good reputation in our state. But even when we do things across town, it's very clear that our students have fewer means. And so we have helped them build tools to create conversation where they don't feel apologetic about what they do or do not have. And so it's been fun for me to see academically, even more fun for me to help kind of march alongside our kids as they try to do awesome things regardless of what they do or don't have.
Thank you. Zane Sheehan, do you want to go next?
Sure. Can you hear me? Okay. My name is Zane Sheehan. I'm originally from Minnesota. I taught high school for about 5 years there, and then was on state staff in California leading the FFA programs, and now I'm doing my PhD at Texas A&M. So kind of a bunch of different roles in ag ed. When I share my background, it's definitely from a place of privilege. I'm a white male, and I grew up with some opportunities there, but also in a very poor family. Like when I chose to join sports, that meant sacrifices for our family. And never really realized how poor I was until high school, when I realized like not everyone has the same kind of experience as me. I can relate to it more now when I'm in this PhD program, because I realize there's far more options available to me as I've made more income and in higher education than I ever had before. And so I guess I've seen myself navigate through those class structures as I've gained more education. I think it's really important to note that these things are all intersectional, because I was able to break free from that poverty class a little bit easier because of my race and gender compared to other people. Where I've seen this most is when I was an ag teacher. We affiliated our program, and as Lavin kind of said, taking away that one small barrier of finances makes a huge difference in how you facilitate and lead your program. We were a heavily Native American school district, and a lot of people think Native American communities and families have a lot of money, and some do, but it's kind of extremes. There's either a lot or they're very poor. And so removing that barrier helped students a lot to find a place in the program, because then they didn't have to go home and ask for money, which they already knew they didn't have. kind of the second place I've seen this is when I was in California. When we look at our ninth grade leadership conferences, attendance at that event really does reflect our population and demographics of the state. About half the participants there are Hispanic students. And when we get to our policy conference, that costs truly about $1,000 to attend, but I think we maybe charge $300 to the kids. It's far less than that. Maybe a quarter or a third of the students are Hispanic. And so you have to think about how these things compile. Like, we just assume that students are going to be able to pay $300, but for some families, like, that's literally not an option. And so the seminars that we've gone through of race and gender and now class are all important, because sometimes it's hard for us as ag educators to think about capitalism and think that's a bad thing. But I think we have to remember that capitalism thrives on the idea that, like, someone's being efficient and outsmarting the system. And so usually the person who's losing in that argument is someone who already is disadvantaged based on race or poverty or whatever it might be. And these things are pretty old too. Like, if you have, if in your family line, if there was slavery and you didn't really gain independence as early as maybe someone who was white and wealthy, like, you've got years of oppression built into that too. And so overcoming these things take time, and they intersect with each other. And we've got a lot of work to do in ag ed to make it so that we are like an even playing field that benefits all of our students.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Sheehan. Erica, do you want to share next?
Sure. So thanks for having me. I'm Erica Tiemann. I am now at the Illinois State Board of Education. I am the Director of Ag Education for the state. Previously, I was at the University of Illinois as a teacher educator in Ag Ed. And then before that, I taught high school Ag in Missouri. And when I was in Missouri, I taught in both a rural school down in the Ozarks, which was a career and tech center. So I had sending students from other districts. Has anybody seen the movie Winter's Bone? If you haven't, you absolutely should. It's very relevant to discussion and commentary on education and class and poverty. Anyways, it was filmed about 30 minutes away from where I was teaching. And I had students who still did not have running water in their homes, dirt floors. And in Missouri, ag teachers have to do SAE visits to every single one of their students every year. And so I was in the students' homes. It was a really interesting change from me. I grew up on a century farm that's been in my family over 100 years, just outside of Kansas City. So the Ozarks was a definite change of scenery and culture and people for me. The generational poverty was something pretty new to me, as where I grew up, there wasn't a whole lot of that. And it was very prevalent where I was at. So that was very interesting. And then after teaching there for a few years, I got the opportunity to open a new ag program in a very wealthy suburb of Kansas City. And so, totally switched gears again. And when I moved there, that kind of added a new layer of having students of color. All of my students when I was down in Rolla were white. Everyone in the school that I went to from grade 6 through 12 were white. So pretty homogenous experience, but I did go to elementary school outside of a Air Force base. And as I think a lot of people know, the military tends to, some people will say prey upon, and other people view it as provide opportunities to people from lower income brackets. And so my formative years were spent in a very diverse environment. So I was kind of in and out of very different environments up to this point in my life. I grew up on a farm, like I said, and I had, my grandparents lived just across the road. My dad's mom grew up on a plantation home in Missouri, Lexington, Missouri, which is where there was a fairly significant Civil War battle. So that plantation home had been in her family her entire life. And I don't know, 5 or 6 generations before her, they were slave owners. I grew up spending summers there with my great-grandmother, and the slave cabins were still there. The overseers' quarters were still there. And it was in my later years that I really learned the full history, that my ancestors actually made their wealth in trafficking slaves. So that was something that my family was not shy about talking about, the history of owning slaves, but they did not talk about what they were actually doing. They said they were farmers, which they did have farm ground. But when I started trying to add things up, it was only a couple hundred acres. And there's no way that my grandparents' parents got as wealthy as they did on a couple hundred acres of farmland. So once I figured that out, there's historical documents about that and everything. So that was an interesting thing that I had a hard time grappling with. And thankfully I had a lot of people to kind of process that with me and talk through how I handled that. And I kind of have forced a lot of my family to acknowledge that that's what our history is, and at least be honest about that rather than ignoring it. So it's kind of a complicated history for me. When it comes to class, more specifically, I've seen, all the differences with my students in different areas I've been in. I grew up comfortably middle class. My dad was a farmer. My mom was a high school chemistry and physics teacher. When I was 3 years old, my mom was diagnosed with leukemia, and she dealt with that for 6 years before she passed away when I was 9. That event caused us to lose the farm that my parents had purchased, and we had to move back to the family farm. And that was because of the medical bills. So for 6 years, bone marrow transplants, all that kind of stuff. So that kind of introduced a new component of class and capitalism in America and our healthcare system and what we're dealing with there. Fortunately, we had a place to land in that my grandparents had my great-grandparents' home that we could move into. So we were very, very fortunate in that way. But I think that's the bigger part of my story. The more recent class example that I can give is when I was in graduate school. I think most of us who have gone on for advanced degrees can probably attest to this as well. The majority of people who get advanced degrees come from fairly wealthy families. They are not generally first-generation college students. And so I am a multi-generation college student, but it was a very different level of people that I was around when I was working on my PhD. And one of my good friends, I knew her family had money, but I didn't really know what level we were talking about until I went one spring break to visit her family in Pennsylvania. And they had a mansion, a literal mansion. And I was like, we pulled up to the house and I was like, holy moly. And then her mom took us shopping, and it was the first time I'd ever been in higher end department stores like Nordstrom and Saks and those kind of places. Her mom bought me a pair of Jimmy Choo shoes. They're like $600 shoes. It surprised me with those, bought them. I didn't know she had bought them and gave them to me when we got to her house. And it was really difficult for me to accept that, coming from a hardworking middle-class farming background. And then there were $100 bottles of wine at dinner. It was really interesting for me to experience that. So I'll quit talking, but that's kind of my gamut of experiences I've had. I've been teaching inclusion and diversity courses for college students and high school teachers for about 10 years now. And so that's been a very cool walk that I've been able to do with a lot of people and helping people grapple with those realities.
Awesome, thank you. And Ms. Wedrick, would you like to go? Hannah? There you are. Oh, can't hear you.
It does show that it's unmuted, but it must not be reading your microphone.
Yeah. Oh. Do you have headphones plugged in?
One thing you can do is on the Zoom platform in the corner, there's a menu that makes sure you can select the right microphone. So if you see where the microphone icon is, there's an upward arrow, and sometimes a system will select the wrong microphone.
Should we go ahead, Hannah, and wait a minute and we'll try and loop you in? No. Okay, if you get it to work, just pop in at any time, okay? So I guess, oh, also, is Zane Christensen on? I didn't see him in the call, but he might be one of our call-in listeners too. So let's give a few seconds for him to pop in. All right. If anybody would like to ask any questions, feel free to pop in. If you're not, if there are no questions, I definitely have some I would like to ask and facilitate, but would like to give the opportunity to anybody who's on the call or wants to put anything in the chat box to offer those for our panelists on the call.
Brandon, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to ask a question. I would share that we are getting an audio loop, I think, from your window. So when questions are being asked, yeah, we'll have to mute. So the question that when I'm sitting back here and listening to these amazing stories from all across our nation and how we view ag education, and, you know, an alternative title for this webinar could have been, do you have to be rich to learn in ag ed? The question I would ask to you, if you could snap your fingers, right? Seriously, snap your fingers and say, this is a specific policy or program intervention that we could utilize in secondary school-based ag education. What would that one thing be? And it can be small, it can be big. I don't want you to limit yourself by, well, this is why it won't work. I really just want to hear, like, if I could have anything, if a genie in a bottle, what would be that one wish?
An endowment fund.
Go.
I would say an endowment fund that I can use for students whenever I need it, not have to worry about it. You know, obviously that's silly, but why not?
This is Lavin. I would say something similar, but I mean, Zane touched on this a little bit. Like, I think we have financial barriers to FFA programming specifically that we, at least in our state, don't really admit. And so if there was a way to get rid of fees to go to things and just be able to get kids where they need to be, regardless of the school's ability for funding, transportation, and just all of those pieces, like just getting rid of the financial barriers for access.
This is Erica. I would echo something very similar, and my mind goes to the SAE experience and program. When I was a teacher, especially down in the Ozarks, if I could have had, you know, a basket of money to help kids start their entrepreneurial projects that they wanted to, while also, teaching them how to use money in a way that they were not familiar with. I think that would have been really awesome.
Something that I talk about this in my state, is that it's more expensive for me to take kids for a one-nighter, which is less than 24 hours of 212 360 of, a certain, whether or not you consider it amazing programming or not, that's entirely different. That's entirely up to you. Versus when I take my kids to a 2.5-day professional conference on soil health. I've worked out a deal with the soil health folks, and I take kids every year. They're happy to they want kids to come to this conference, and it's at the same resort as 212 360. And so, and we're paying for meals. So it's really frustrating because I'm like, it's just that we're paying for the content so much more for 212 360. We're paying 4 times as much for the 24 hours of content from 212 360 as we are for the content from a 2.5-day soil health conference. And that just gets me every year. And I try and bring it up, and
In Minnesota, we found the same thing. And so we write our own conference now and bring in our own people. So if you want the curriculum, let me know. I wrote it. So
I have a question for the panelists, and Lavin, I'm in, and yes, we'll talk about that. But so I have a question for the panelists. So I work in a relatively middle-class school. I mean, we have probably 40% free and reduced lunch rate. My husband works in a high-poverty school 40 minutes away. And the question is always, my question is, because I see it a lot, and I see it even in the impoverished kids in my town, is how do we encourage a love of knowledge and learning and in a desire to learn in an impoverished community, especially like in a high poverty town where my husband works, that the parents don't care about school. The parents don't care if the kids even graduate. And that's something that is completely unfamiliar to me, because I grew up in a relatively wealthy town, went to a relatively wealthy school. I was considered a redneck for being from Wisconsin instead of Chicago at my college. So that's something that I struggle with, and I don't know how to help my husband, and it's frustrating. So I'm sorry, Dane, for cutting you off. I don't know where the button is.
No, it's all good. Sorry. I'm not good at things. I was kind of thinking, wait, do I have to do anything else, or am I in good shape now? Everything's good? Okay, cool. I was thinking, sorry, I was spending so much time trying to find the hand raise button. I maybe zoned out for a sec. So I apologize if some of these things have already been mentioned. I think we do just so much of this is pay to play. And so you pay your money in advance to get the experience. And I think sometimes what happens is we have created a system of assumption where people automatically or inherently find value in what they anticipate that experience being, and thus find that whatever limited income they have is worth investing in that experience. And so I think ag ed, just inherently we lose kids because from whatever family background they might have, their parents are not necessarily going to know that going to a leadership conference is going to be more valuable than spending or investing that income on something else. And so eliminating, like in a dream world, eliminating any like conference fees, certainly the whole affiliation thing is nonsensical to me. It just blows my mind that we would even be having to have this conversation in a wealthy country that Yeah, but I would say like anything that is additional that asks kids to pay up front for something is just a bad call. So, sorry. So we, a leadership conference, Zane mentioned like the Sacramento Leadership Experience is $350, and I can't figure out how I would ever ask a parent to spend $350 to send their child when money's so tight to something that feels really just wildly unnecessary. And so eliminating any fees and instead trying to create selection mechanisms that are based around attitude and demonstration of work ethic and building our ways to allow kids to have experiences around things that are probably more closely related to their ability to be affected by them would be kind of my dream world.
If I can chime in on the end of that, I think a big component of all these things, like normative frameworks, survive because they need to be hidden. Like the white normative framework against people of color survives because we assume that's how it is for everyone. And so part of this class issue would be uncovering that hidden components of class and how that affects lives. And so making that known first, and then we start to tackle them. Like we can't just make this assumption that everyone affords it. First, we have to uncover this issue that this affects a lot of people. And then once it's known in public, we can start combating it. And so there's lots of things like kids don't have food at home and they're afraid to talk about it. So it remains this hidden thing that no one's really willing to address. But the second we bring it public, we can start talking about and finding solutions like food pantries and repackaging lunches to be taken home by students after school. And so I believe step one is to start talking about these things and really bring them public so that they're not considered part of the normative anymore, and we can start working to find solutions.
Tiffany, did you want to chime in?
Oh, sorry. Yes, I wanted to chime in. I wanted to answer to Natasha's question, like how do you get students involved? Most of our students, I think it mentioned it was about 70% are on fixed or a reduced lunch or free or reduced lunch. So we have a lot of students from different neighborhoods in the city that are struggling, and some of them are from single parent homes and so forth. So when the kids come to us asking, I really want to go to that state conference, but I don't have $75 or $100 to pay for it, we have to come up with ways as an at cost where we cut the cost, but we also give kids opportunities in the school to help them to do some extracurricular activities to help them pay for it. So it's kind of like volunteerism. So the kids are already at the school anyway, so they just want to do extra stuff. But to get the parents involved, it's usually a struggle because they're always concerned with funds. We kind of have to swing it or pitch the activities as, how is this going to help the kid in the future? Parents are always looking at ways, how is this going to help my child get into college? How is this going to help my child get a job? How is this going to help my child get scholarships? And we have to look at it from a future perspective, because we get a lot of kids that want to do internships and programs that are ag-based that are not in the city. And they kind of get like, well, I can't do it, Miss T, because my parents can't afford to send me there. Okay, what do we need to do to get you there? We're coming out of pocket paying for kids going on the bus to get up to Penn State for the 4-week conference, or we're paying for kids to go to WLC because they're not able to come out of pocket. So a lot of it's fundraising, but two, we have to encourage parents, like there is a benefit for their kids' future, because they will shy upon it because of costs, but we have to come up with ways to encourage them to do so. And it is a struggle. My other issue I had, and this was another piece with programming, a couple people mentioned about conferences and paying for it. The paying for certain programs to help them to get certain state degrees or national degrees, like with Pennsylvania is the Keystone, and then the American degree. And there's a certain amount of hours that the kids have to have, or areas where they have to have on their application saying you have to do a state level event or national level event. Well, it's tough for us to go to nationals because of the cost. So it's not fair for our kids to do a national level, not be able to get a national level event in if we're not able to pay for it. So I think the degree system is kind of rigged for kids who cannot afford it, because they would have to pay to go to these conferences in order for them to get a degree. So something in that nature have to change.
You're totally right too, because if we look at when FFA and NFA merged, a requirement of the American degrees at the time was ownership and entrepreneurship, and land ownership was very difficult in a time of segregation. And so even if we trace back our historical implications, like it was never an even playing field when NFA and FFA merged, because the requirements of American degrees were so built upon classism and entrepreneurship.
I wonder if, do any individuals kind of given to that point of the degree system, are there suggestions for solutions to ways that that can be look more equitable, or even an adaptation of what it looked like given the historical implications that Mr. Jim mentioned?
We've proposed a constitutional change, so 2 of the last 3 years for the American degree to have an unpaid option, especially with the SAE for all work, that it would provide students who have high-level SAEs that might be in research or some other unpaid option, because I know our students in the Metro have similar experiences. I mean, they could do thousands of hours of research and still not qualify for the American degree. So we've brought it to the delegate process twice, and it continues to get defeated.
So I always get energized when I see folks coming together. And, I think I'm going to go ahead and put a plug in there. We're going to debrief. So what is that meeting, Brandon? Next week that we get you and Amy and John and I on the line and try to figure out, Penn State and University of Minnesota just threw in and said, hey, why don't we do something? Let's keep these conversations out there. So we're going to talk about whether or not we need to continue doing something, just to keep the conversation out front. And when I get all the people, you get busy just like y'all, right? 10 million things, and then you're like, oh my gosh, why are we doing something else? The easy answer is no. And then I get on here and I get excited with the great thoughts and minds and people. But I have to say, like, a valid criticism would be, look who's on the line, right? Are we just preaching to the choir? Heard that earlier. Someone said we're just preaching to the choir. And I said, well, sometimes the choir needs a place to sing too, right? To kind of share and know that you're not alone. So how do we think about the notion of taking these topics and engaging and turning them into pragmatic answers that we can share with those who are in the vast majority and middle, right? They're not on either spectrum of our political world or what have you, but you can say, here's a practical concept that you can use to help your program be more inclusive to avoid classism. And there's something rubbing here that I haven't figured out. I don't think we come here with answers. We just come here to kind of maybe chew and hear ourselves talk sometimes. Being very honest, like, hey, in agriculture, like the very essence and ethos of an industry is like picking yourself up from the bootstraps kind of notion. We get really sentimental and teary-eyed talking about that, yeah, we use degrees to represent work ethic, to recognize that, not just jocks or those with smart grades. And in the big picture that we're changing their actual net worth to begin to help them. I mean, we love the story, right, of the kid that had an SAE, grew, saved money, and then used that money to pay to go to college. And then because they were in college, went from low class to middle class. I mean, so how do we navigate that space? I don't know. I'm going to listen now.
As someone who did not grow up in ag ed and came to ag ed late in life, I personally, if you would have told me about those stories, I would have rolled my eyes and called bullshit on most of them. So I would have said, what privilege were they granted that gave them the ability to do that? And so I really we need like the idea of, I guess I haven't looked at the state degree requirements in other states. In Wisconsin, we do not require that any of the work be paid. So that's one thing. It has been frustrating for us to look at the American degree and figuring out we've gotten it. I know we've made some American degrees work. We have definitely made American degrees work that way. And we have enough things that we're allowed to count on the state degree that don't cost any money. Or at least don't like, we have a sectional leadership workshop every year that costs $0, and you can take any kid you want to that. And so if you pinpoint a kid as a freshman that's like, someday you're, you know, like, or a senior that you're like, hey, you've done everything you need but this to get your state degree, take you to that. And so, you know, it's hard to get everything without all the dollars. But, you know, and my chapter's fortunate because we have a test plot, and test plots make money. So, but, yeah.
Erica, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about Sarah LaRosa's comment real quick. I'm scrolling back to find it on the pre-service teachers, and something that since I've been in Illinois, that when I was a teacher educator, and now that I'm kind of in a position where I am controlling the purse strings of ag ed for the state, so to say, we really started pushing very hard on how can we cover the expenses of being a pre-service ag teacher. And I'll turn on the video so I just am not a disembodied voice.
Because you're making every other state wish they had a teacher educator as their state supervisor right now. Because that's what I'm sitting there thinking, oh yeah, you understand that concern.
I do. So when I was at the university, I lobbied really hard with everybody I know who controlled any money to get grants and scholarships for our pre-service teachers. And the first step was I was able to get a $4,000 grant for all of our pre-service teachers that they had for their senior year. And it was split into 2 payments for the both semesters to help defray the cost of student teaching and their testing, and also having to drive to do all these observation hours that the College of Education required. And those start in their sophomore year. And then, you know, the Ed TPA costs $300. So we were able to use grant funding to cover that for all of our students for the first time that they took it. And now that I'm in the position I am quadrupling the funding that the state provides to the universities and community colleges that are involved in ag education for FY20. So I'm pretty excited to see how that money gets used in helping to level the playing field and just reduce the barriers for our pre-service teachers. I worked 3 jobs while I was going to school for my bachelor's degree, and I would not want anybody else to have to do that. I was able to graduate without any debt because of it, but I struggled through college because of it as well. So for me, I'm really prioritizing how to handle the very pertinent comment that Sarah raised. So other states, what are you doing? What have you heard of?
So California is the state that invented the affiliation program concept, and that originates because we had a legislator that said if we're going to mandate something in our state education curricular code, that we have to fund it as well. And so our curricular code says that FFA is a mandatory piece, and so we have legislation that says FFA should be funded by the state. I think you could take that same kind of concept and apply it in other states, and if we were to grow that idea of like, if we're going to require these programs, we should be able to provide resources for them. And I feel you on the teacher preparation idea, because it's so hard sending these students into teacher prep programs and they have no money. And I remember I had bad credit for 7 years after going through that. And so I think these professional careers like law and medicine and teaching, if you privileged enough to be a professional career, assume a certain level of wealth in order to get through the program. And we've got to do something. I know Minnesota's got some grants that are available to student teachers, but they're certainly probably not enough.
I know here in Indiana, there's a pipeline scholarship that's called, and students who commit to teaching agriculture in Indiana for 5 years after they graduate with their ag ed degree get some sort of student loan forgiveness or scholarship that helps offset the cost of their attending school. I'm not familiar with anything that helps them with like the day-to-day costs or helping offset their driving to go observe places. I've only been in this position for a very short time so far, so I'm still learning a lot about how things work here in Indiana. But I'm trying to think of different ways that we can help increase access for our students, and even those who are from maybe some higher class families may not have the access to a car on campus, and when we require them to go out and do teacher observations, that requires them being able to transport themselves there. And when you're surrounded by exceptionally rural areas, there's not public transportation that allows for that to happen easily. So one of the things that we were talking about earlier about like, what could you, if you had anything in like no limits, I think about transportation. How can we get our school-based ag ed students to be able to easily get to different events? Because let's face it, even though if we weave in career development and leadership development event stuff into our curriculum during the school day, there's more stuff that happens outside of school to help get kids ready for a competition. And if kids are from families that can't afford to drive and pick them up after school, or there's no after school bus, then that eliminates them from being able to participate in those competitions. And then the domino effect happens from there. So I think about transportation and the support that those students have to be able to do that, because they have parents that want to support them, but they have to be able to put food on the table. So their job takes precedence over being able to drive and pick them up somewhere.
I wonder if we could switch gears a little bit. One thing that I've been thinking about, and that's been mentioned quite a few times on this call too, is just how intersectional other identities play into this. And I'm wondering if any of our panelists or any other participants on the call too would be able to share about how they've seen class and race, gender, sexuality intersect with each other, and how that maybe has compounded class and how they've experienced class with their students in young people.
I could go ahead and say a few things. Yeah, good. Okay, I think certainly in states that have a really strong, produce industry, we've got, and I know we're not the only one. I think there's other states on the West Coast and the Southeast, Michigan even, that have a really large farm worker contingent who tend to occupy a certain social strata. And it's fascinating because of, I think, in my mind, the divergence between the notion that education should be here to serve and lift up all people, and the fact that there's some pretty significant barriers, even within ag education, for those who come from a background that doesn't have maybe as much cultural or social, and certainly not as much economic capital. And so, like, I see it when we bring students to National Convention every year. Most of the students that we bring are local booster funds, and we figure out how to make it happen so that there's no way their families could allow that to occur in terms of their budgets by and large. And so it's, I think, pretty interesting to me that our students feel often like kind of like one of these things is not like the others. And they look around and not as many students as they see at home really look like them. But I think also we work hard to construct a narrative that reminds them of the empowerment associated with that. The fact that, hey, look, if you're doing it, what message are you sending to others about their potential to do that as well? And, they get called names, and I took students to the Washington Leadership Conference a couple years ago, and they were pretty openly subjected to some offensive remarks based on, I think a perception about their ethnicity and a perception about sort of the clothes they wore and the kind of things that might be normal for them. And I think for me, it really came down to a question of my values and what outcomes make us a good ag program and make me a good ag teacher. And I don't know that we have a lot of conversation about this nationally, and certainly we're finally kind of having this here in our home state about what does a really good ag program look like. And it has to go back to this notion that for us, when we can serve all kids and elevate all kids and change systems to allow that to occur, then that's when we can celebrate being a really high quality ag program. Even if those students don't have as much of the capital coming in, can we build capital with their time here? And then allow those students to understand that they are serving as a model for others. And then us as teachers who have been able to do that, how do we network and provide resources for one another? You know, I'm incredibly Caucasian, and so few of my students are, and yet somehow there's a conversation that occurs in our town that if you're Hispanic and if you want to be successful, you join ag at Galt High School, because the system is such that you're going to go on to career preparation in college and have a great experience in high school that kind of launches you into something. So I think it's about being really mindful, and then how we have conversation about what our values are. And is it about, you know, I think there was an old narrative about being a good ag teacher means you win lots of things, and being a good ag teacher means your students are champions at lots of things. And I think we can reframe that as, hey, how are you taking those who don't come in with much and elevating them into a spot where they can serve as a model for all kids?
Erica, did you want to share something?
Yeah, I would just, I appreciate what Dane just said. I have always told my pre-service teachers, there are a good portion of our students that we have that will be successful in any program they're in. They don't need the ag ed program. It's the ones who, you know, aren't gifted and talented in ways that is going to put them in a competitive place for other, you know, band or choir, or debate or swimming or basketball. Those are the kids that we can really, really serve and help if we focus that way. So, but back to the original question on intersecting identities with class. So I've got a couple thoughts on this. One is that I saw more than one student in my time in teaching who, after coming out as LGBTQ, became homeless. I saw that happen multiple times. And so that is a issue. And I don't know that all ag teachers have ever had to face that or even know that about some of their students, that they're facing those challenges. The other thing I've seen is I've seen girls when they become when they become pregnant, that they become homeless. I have seen how expensive it is to be poor. So I've seen students or their parents who have health issues or mental health issues. And if you are poor, it is more expensive to have those conditions than if you are middle class or above. And it's more expensive in the way that you can't get the proper care that you need. And so then the compounding expenses really build up. And then when you add the fact that most people who are challenged economically, they are also exposed to more environmental risk, whether that's the food they eat, the air they breathe, the safety of the environment they are living in. And so you have this snowball effect. And it was really hard to see that and come to grips with that as a teacher. And then, you know, we've got the fact that in 30 states, I believe today, employment can be denied and you can be fired simply because of sexual orientation or gender identity in the US today. And a lot of people aren't aware of that either. So that's my thoughts on that one.
Did anybody else have any other thoughts they wanted to chime in there?
Erica, you hit that like on the nail. Like I've seen that way too many times. I just added it on chat. Before we can get into teaching, you kind of have to break the ice, like what's going on with them. And we deal with kids that are homeless or dealing with identity, dealing with stuff from parents because they just came out with to their parents. kids that are homeless. I had a student this year who lost her mother and then 2 weeks later lost her grandmother and hasn't been in school. So she missed half of the school year and is a senior. I have another kid who is a drug dealer and he's known in the city, but he's like, I don't know what to do. I want to get out, but I'm stuck. So you kind of have to break the ice first with the kid. And it's like, well, what do you do first? Teaching is the last thing you do. You're more of the social worker, the therapist, the nurse, just making sure that they have the necessary things to make sure, are you going home tonight safe? Are you going to have food in your house for the next day? Do you have money to get back to school the next day, and so forth? That is a challenge within teaching, but at the same time, we kind of have to address those issues first so that they can open up to learn, because they really do. It's just that they have a lot of barriers that they're dealing with that's outside of school.
On this somewhat depressing topic, I want to share a success story I had just this week, because it made me smile. So that I've had this kid. He's a senior, and he's been both in my homeroom and in my ag classes all 4 years, and he's a squirrel. He's the kid who you turn your back on him for 1 second, he is out the door. You are putting an APB on him with the assistant principal, you know, and he walks in. He's late every day. You check, you know, is he stoned today? Probably. You move on. But he's also just a really like wonderful kid, and he's got such amazing energy. And this year, we had a shortage of kids for our wildlife CDE team, and CDE regionals were last week. And like we never really invited him, despite being an affiliated chapter. He'd never really been involved in FFA because he really had never been able to commit to anything. And so just kind of on a whim, you know, a few days before the trip, we just said, hey, do you want to be on this team? You're actually, you know, you're very passionate about wildlife and you know a lot, and, you know, we know you haven't practiced, but you want to try it. And so he came along and he had a blast, and he got the best score of anyone on the team. And now they didn't make state, but he's got a fire under his butt. And he said to me, gosh, Mrs. Paris, I really wish there was a way I could go to college to be a wildlife biologist. Is there anything we can do? And I know he has no money. And so, and my deadline, but it was 2 days before my alumni and I were about to sit down to determine our scholarships for the year. And so the deadline had passed, but I said, hey buddy, I've got this scholarship form, fill it out. And, you know, maybe I can get you something. And so he's not getting a huge scholarship because his FFA involvement is much lower than everyone else's, but someone on the scholarship committee knows him and knows how much need he has. And, you know, and maybe he won't go to school, but, you know, if the scholarship can get him to take 2 classes at a tech school to get him to take the bug, you know, because our tech school does have a natural resources program, you know, maybe. And now he's actually prepping. You don't have to qualify for our state forestry CDE. And he actually is an arborist. He works as an arborist in the summer. And so he's like got a fire under his butt, and he's really excited. And this is a kid who everyone in the school, the principal, all the other teachers had just kind of written off. And because of, he came from nothing and had nothing, and we didn't think he was going anywhere. And so, yay. So there's a happy story.
That would be a good story to shift directions and kind of give some concluding thoughts. I'm going to share the last few slides, and then I think Dr. Foster wanted to ask maybe for some feedback for those who are willing to stay on, just kind of for the future of the webinar, if anybody is willing to share that information. So I'll share the reflective questions. Share my screen to do that. Can you see it? Yeah, thumbs up if you can see it. Reflective questions. So these are the questions that we shared at the beginning for those who are watching later, especially to think about and reflect on. And then here's some of the resources that some of our panelists helped put together for those who are interested in kind of learning more about the history of class, how it's intersected with various identities, and how we really see it play out still today. And then lastly, I'll share this quote at the end here. I actually just saw it today, but I thought it was very applicable. So, changes in small places also affect the global system, not through incrementalism, but because every small system participates in unbroken wholeness. Activities in one part of the whole create effects that appear in distant places. We never know how our small activities will affect others through the invisible fabric of our connectedness. So for those panelists that joined us, just want to say thank you for the ways that you're operating as a small system and trying to break into that unbroken wholeness, and encourage others who are watching, who are participating with us right now live, that you feel encouraged also to do the same way. Not in an incremental way, but in a way that you're working in the interconnectedness in which we're all working. So with that, I'll maybe turn it to Dr. Foster if you want to ask questions for feedback.